This is why most scholars do not believe that the character of Moses was an actual person, but just a literary character. My guy is saying he didn't think that Moses existed. And I like that Mystic is saying that if he did live, and that's a big if, he was likely one of Akhenaten's higher ranking disciples. It is not even plausible based on the story that he could have been Akhenaten's high ranking disciples, nor could he have been Akhenaten himself. You see, you have to recognize that within the story, it talks about Moses is dealing with Ramesses, more specifically Ramesses II. Ramesses II began ruling Egypt in 1279, whereas Akhenaten ruled Egypt in the 1350s, 1353, around that time frame. So we have a big time jump between Akhenaten and Ramesses. Now you can say that Moses could have been alive during the time frame of Akhenaten and during the time frame of Ramesses, right? Because we're looking at roughly about 60 years of difference between the two. But the problem is that according to the Moses story, Moses grew up as a stepbrother to Ramesses. Moses could not have been one of the high-ranking officials of Akhenaten and grow up as a stepbrother to Ramesses, because he would have had to be an adult during the time frame of being with Akhenaten. And so the math don't math. The math just ain't mathing when you look at it from the actual historical perspective of what is going on. Plus, during none of those time frames does it ever talk about in Egyptian history that these plagues ever happened and the firstborn child of every Egyptian ever dying. That is nowhere within the Egyptian history. And many people like to then say that, well, Egypt wouldn't have wrote about their losses. As far as losing slaves and losing a fight, let me just say I give you that one. But what the Egyptians would definitely have most certainly wrote about is if all the children who were firstborns died, specifically firstborn died. That is something they would write about, because it's not a loss from another people. It is just a loss. They would have written about droughts, but just like they did with King Droser, because this is before Pharaohs, with King Droser, they wrote about a common drought. But if he went and rebuilt the temple of, I believe, Amun, then they could avoid the drought, because his guy Yusuf broke down his dream, which is where you get Joseph the Dreamer story from. So they do write down those things when they have droughts, when they lose animals, when they plagues hit them, things of that nature. These things would have been written down, but they did not write them down, and they were very, very, very into writing down their history. So the math just don't math as far as him being anywhere near Akhenaten. It was actually Sigmund Freud who was the first person to kind of say that Akhenaten and Moses were the same person. But Sigmund Freud is a psychologist. He is not an archaeologist. And it has just been shown that Moses could not have been Akhenaten, because Akhenaten existed as a pharaoh and not as a stepson or a participant in the royal family, but an actual pharaoh himself. So it could not have been Akhenaten. Plus, biblical scholarship also differs in when they say Moses was born. If you listen to some of the old church fathers like Jerome, Jerome says in the 1500s, whereas rabbinical Judaism says that he was born in the 1300s. So there's a 200-year gap between when people are saying and thinking that Moses could have been born, but there's actually zero, absolutely zero archaeological evidence that demonstrates that Moses existed, that demonstrates that 2 million Jewish slaves were in Egypt and they all left at the same time. Plus another added thing that you want to consider in this. When you look at a people who were oppressed by another group of people for 400 years, and those people leave, undoubtedly, those people would carry with them many of the traditions of the people that they just left. Let me give you an example. If you were to take every black American and move them to another continent just for themselves, let's say Australia was empty, you moved all the black Americans to Australia, undoubtedly there are certain things that will still continue within that culture that we picked up, that we carry from the American culture. Our system of government would be similar. Our language would be similar. Our customs, our traditions, there will be similarity. Our pottery, our weaponry would have similarities. So although we may not carry the same God, and although we may have a different language, and we could have a different language, because let me say they kept their Jewish language, their Hebrew language, then there would have been Egyptian influences within their language, and there would also have been Egyptian influence in their pottery, their weapons, the way they build their houses. Their entire society would have those influences, because black Americans would have those American influences. If we moved to our own land and started our own country, we would still have those influences. But when we look at the Jewish people who are established historically in the 1200s BCE, what we do not see is remnants of 400 years of Egyptian captivity. What we see is remnants of Canaanites, of leaving and separating from the Canaanite people, because their pottery is similar, their weaponry is similar, their agriculture is similar, their language is similar. Hell, their God got the same name. The Canaanite high god was El. El had a wife named Asherah. Asherah had sons. Those sons were Baal and Yahweh. And over time, the Hebrew people began to worship Yahweh. And then as you continue to read in their Old Testament, as the Hebrew culture, the Israelite culture developed through the Assyrians, through the Babylonians, they developed into Yahweh becoming El. Yahweh then being the husband of Asherah, Baal and Mot being their children, and then getting rid of Baal and Mot, and then getting rid of Asherah and making her into a stick, to finally just having Yahweh and El merged together as one deity, as an unborn deity that was different from all the other gods. And people like to think about Akhenaten now, because Akhenaten was teaching the same thing, that there is just one supreme deity that has never been born, does not have children, and is represented by the light of the sun. Not the sun, didn't worship the sun, but just represented by that. So since it has those similarities to Akhenaten, people have a tendency to draw that Akhenaten conclusion. But there are more similarities to the Canaanites, as if they separated from the Canaanites, which most archaeological evidence in and around the 1200 BCE demonstrates that they separated from the prime group of Canaanites and developed into their own group during the Bronze Age collapse, so that by the time we get to around 900 to 800 BCE, they are an independent nation of them within themselves, and have developed a distinctive culture that was different, but carryovers from the Canaanite, more so from the Canaanite than any other group. So y'all have a great day, and remember always, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.